As there are many German native speakers in the room and we heard about our perfect translators with decades of experience, I'm also going to give my talk in German. But anyway, my slides will be in English. Also, hallo auch von meiner Seite. Ich bin die Martina Mara vom Electronica.
So, hi, I'm Martina Mara from the Electronica Future Lab. We've heard an inspiring introduction by Alexander. He has already mentioned the development of FO15. I myself would like to focus on the research collaboration between Mercedes-Benz and the Ars Electronica Future Lab in recent years. Just in case there are people in the audience who have not been to the Ars Electronica Future Lab for whatever reason, the Ars Electronica Future Lab is the research and development facility of Ars Electronica. We are a transdisciplinary team, about 30 people with different backgrounds, ranging from IT, hardware, software development, interaction design, but there are also artists, media artists, social scientists. I myself am responsible for robopsychology at the Ars Electronica Future Lab. What is this all about? It sounds like the classical humanoid robot lying on the psychotherapeutic couch, talking about his traumatic childhood experiences. But this is not what it's all about, of course, because I'm not interested in the well-being of robots. On the contrary, I'm interested in the well-being of human users, people who are going to use robots in the futures that will be present in our everyday lives. People should feel well and comfortable in their environment when interacting with robots. So my research field also focuses on how robots should look like. So what about the visual design? On the other hand, how should they interact and communicate with different target groups so that the robots can be accepted and we feel comfortable with them? This is not something that we should take for granted because, on the one hand, we all know that robotics is a very trendy field. Lots of things are happening. On the other hand, though, in Europe and in the United States, there are still lots of people who are skeptical when it comes to the idea of having social interactions with a robot. When they are close to people, when there are situations that require empathy, as Alexander pointed out. So there is a lot of skepticism still around. There's also a bit of fear regarding autonomous theories, and therefore robots and robopsychology are an interesting field of research. Robots should be designed so that they are accepted. Still, there are a number of challenges in the coming years. So let me briefly mention our research field. We want to create positive interaction experiences with robots. How can we do this? One aspect that Alex already referred to is the following. We should not create robots that give us the impression that they replace or copy human beings. For many years in research, we've seen that human-like robots are very often rejected. So there's this primal fear of man to be replaced by machines who might be even more intelligent than we are. If the robot clearly remains a machine, it's usually easier for us to interact with the robot and to accept it. Something else we do not want is to create technology that would overrule human beings. Technology that is too dominant. We want team building, human-robot teams. As Alex mentioned, we want to also focus on the strengths of human beings and the strengths of technology in order to create well-functioning teams. Another challenge is the increase of user acceptance and trust in technology. And we can do this by communication, by providing information. We know from research that when people are not sure about what robots can do, what functions and skills they have, this may cause fear. When the robot communicates and informs people about what it can do and cannot do, we can increase user acceptance. So in robo-psychology, we usually deal with the classical humanoid robot image. We have service robots for our homes, in the healthcare sector. And now there's a new type of social robot, as Alex mentioned, the autonomous vehicle. KIT happens. You're familiar with this picture, artificial intelligence on four wheels. This goes back to the 1980s, the TV series. FO15, and you can see it outside, of course, looks much more elegant. You've probably seen the FO15. It looks much more elegant than KIT in the 1980s, and it has many more functions. So we have a new type of social robot, which in the next 10 or 15 years, 20 years, will be around in our cities, in our neighborhoods. This raises new questions, social questions. How will it feel to be surrounded by a swarm of mobility robots, intelligent mobile robots? There will not just be a single robot around, there will be more of them. These mobile robots will communicate with each other. They are part of a network which is invisible to us. We don't know what processes are taking place, how these robots communicate with each other. And this may mean a loss of control for us. So we can use design elements in order to counteract this development. Trust, of course, is very important when it comes to self-driving cars. We need to feel safe. And then it's all about interaction with the passengers in the car. How is this going to happen? How will the self-driving car interact with its passengers? And also, how will the car communicate with the people around it, with pedestrians, with cyclists, or whatever that will be around in 15 or 20 years. And finally, a question that kept us very busy, with us and Mercedes-Benz. Let me show you a catchy example. Why will it be necessary to consider external communication by self-driving cars? Let's consider the situation of a person, a pedestrian, wishing to cross the street, a car approaching from the left. As a rule, we establish eye contact briefly with the human driver. So there is mutual understanding as to what's going to happen. The driver has noticed me, and it means I can cross the street safely. But what happens when you have a self-driving robot car with no driver inside? How can I be sure that the car has recognized me? How can we establish eye contact or replace eye contact? Do we want to replace eye contact? This is one of the essential questions in our research cooperation. So in this research cooperation, one of the questions was, how can we explore these questions? How do we approach this issue? And how can we approach this coexistence between robots and human beings, something which doesn't exist today yet. So, if we create a research setting where we have ideal autonomous self-driving cars in an ideal urban setting, this is something which for several reasons cannot be implemented yet. So we considered alternatives to approach the issue in a haptic and physical manner. We can use virtual reality, virtual simulations for such scenarios. Together with Mercedes, though, we wanted also to provide a haptic experience, a shared space with robots that can be felt and experienced. So we developed two experimental designs, which we have already presented and which you can view here at the festival. The first experiment, which we briefly saw in the movie, the video that Alex showed us, are shared space spaxels. Some of you will know what spaxels are. Spaxels are pixels in space. The quadcopters that were developed at the Electronica Future Lab, they have LED modules, which normally can be used to draw pictures in space, 50 or 60 quadcopters together. We used these spaxels for our experiment as the first representatives of future mobile robots. We developed this experimental design last year. It can also be viewed here at the festival. It's an 8 by 8 meter large space with cameras and sensors, 3 quadcopters, 3 spaxels with LED modules that show different colors. And we have indicated a number of future traffic situations, potential traffic situations. So we have a few pieces of furniture, a cross-shaped table where the spaxels, they can fly over this piece of furniture. Then we have the parking spaces, the terminals in the background. The purpose of this experiment was that by using spaxels, we would develop or show future potential mobility scenarios. For instance, what's going to happen when you have an autonomous robot and you want to cross the street? How do you communicate with the robot? And we used spaxels for that purpose. I'll show you the video once again in full length. And you can see the types of interaction and communication that we could actually achieve in this first experiment. We used gestures to communicate with the robots. For instance, raising your hand as if you wanted to call a taxi. That helped you fetching the drone. The human interaction partners had a sort of magic car key, a haptic object that could be used to control the spaxels, but the emphasis was on using gestures for communication. We wanted to test which gestures work better than others, which are intuitive gestures, and regarding the robot, the spaxels, they communicated mostly via light signals. So there was bilateral communication from human beings to the robot and vice versa. and we cannot use the same types or means of communication because we do not have the same channels available. But the light signals worked quite well. I'll show you another example. Apart from light signals, spaxels could also communicate by specific movements. So when it was the situation of calling a taxi, the quad cop that approached me indicated by a light signal that it was available. And it also showed a sort of wobbling movement, which meant I'm available. Let me show you one particular scene, which we briefly saw in the video. The classical crosswalk situation, a person trying to cross the street. What happens if you don't have eye contact with a driver? Will the robot stop or won't it stop? Has it seen me? Can I cross the street safely or can't I? So this is the scenario that we developed. There was one spaxel moving on a circuit, and then there was a test person who indicated that it wanted to cross the street or the flight path of the spaxel. So the first condition or possibility was as follows. The quadcopter approached the test person from the left and then stopped suddenly. This was strange for some persons because they weren't sure, is it going to stop or isn't it? So we developed a second version for the same type of scenario with a simple light signal. So the SWAT cop announcing in advance, I have recognized you, I will stop, and you can safely cross my flight path. So this was quite a simple experiment, but this proactive communication, I have noticed you, everything is fine, these signals are very important. A picture illustrating the same situation. Here we have the editor-in-chief of a German newspaper acting as a test person. So this was the use of spaxels. Then a second experiment that we developed together with Mercedes. We no longer use the spaxels for future testing of self-driving robots or cars and human beings. Rather, we used shared space bots. 6 terrestrial robots that were specially developed. They too were equipped with LED modules. They had an LED eye looking upwards, communicating light signals, and they also had an LED circle or crown around it, which allowed them to communicate with the outside world. Another means of communication that we used, and here you have an overview of the installation, was ground projections as an augmentation for each of these robots. So we could also present zebra crossings, for instance, so that the FO15 will know it has to stop. So with these ground projections that we used in this experiment, we could simulate this situation as well. So here you have the second experiment with the terrestrial robots. The emphasis was less on gestures as a means of communication, because with the spaxels we already noticed that there would be a few challenges regarding the use of gestures. So the idea was to try out something else. In the second experimental design, the robot no longer needed gestures. Rather, the posture of the person and the direction he was walking in were important indicators for the robot. So here again, the same situation, the robot approaching from the left, the person wants to cross the street. He doesn't have to make any big gestures. Rather, the robot recognizes the person standing at the curb, it brakes, slows down, and when the test person takes a step forward, the robot immediately recognizes that the person wants to cross the street. If the test person takes a step back, the robot assumed, well, the person is just standing at the curb, doesn't want to cross the street, and it would move on. If the robot recognized, or when the robot recognized that the person wanted to cross the street, a zebra crossing was projected onto the surface. A second situation that we started testing was also mentioned by Alex in his presentation with the Padlet idea. We used 4 reflectors or signposts that sort of designated a human zone, an area that is recognized by the robot as a no-go zone. This zone is then reserved for people and can be used in a flexible manner. The idea or vision is to have a lot of flexibility in an urban area, designating areas where no cars, no robots will enter, so you can have a picnic or set up table tennis, a ping pong table. So the human wishes and requirements are met by technology. And this was something we could actually try out and test in this experiment. I'll show you another brief video, which is not so sophisticated. It was not produced by Mercedes, rather it was produced by the Ars Electronica Future Lab. Here you have the terrestrial robots and the ground projection, which is used as an augmentation. The robots actually acquired identities, different identities. We can test different or simulate different traffic scenarios. Sometimes a robot would act as an FO15. The green robot actually acted like a little girl. Its identity was that of a little girl. So we could actually go through different scenarios. Here you have the situation that I showed you previously, crossing the street. And here, the signposts with robots avoiding this zone automatically. This will be an important issue for shared space, the shared space concept in the future. People will also have to consider robots because they may not be able to act within a millisecond, and robots have to take note of the concerns of human beings as well. Most people have never had the feeling of being surrounded by robots, apart from automatic lawnmower, perhaps. But we wanted to produce a haptic experience with the use of several computers, and we feel that this is a very practical, hands-on research approach to deal with these problems. And we believe that this approach has a number of advantages over other virtual simulations. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to briefly mention some early learnings that we've gained from these first experiments. Of course, these are preliminary learnings. We will continue our cooperation. What we've seen in these 2 experiments is that proactive communication by self-driving cars or robots does not happen in an invisible manner. Of course, technology wouldn't have to communicate with the outside because everything happens automatically. Cars communicate with each other anyway. But for the purpose of trust in technology, in order to have a positive interaction with robots, it will be essential that these mobile robots also communicate with the outside via light signals, for instance. The FO15 with the blue light signal indicates its autonomous mode. So these will be essential features. We want to know right away what the robot tells us with its light signal. So we want to know this is a robot that is moving autonomously, and every child needs to be aware of this. So things must not be complicated. If there's no blue light on the FO15, we should rightly be able to assume that a human being is driving the car, which will be possible for the FO15. So communicating via light signals has turned out to be quite successful and intuitive in our first experiment. Communicating via gestures, well, it's fun. We like to experiment with that. There are a number of simple gestures that are intuitive, like showing a stop sign. This is something that people do automatically. But there are a number of challenges. Cultural interpretation differences, telling someone to approach or to move away. There are differences between Austria and Japan, for instance. And this, of course, will also be a problem when trying to communicate with computers. And there may be situations where instead of complicated gestures, the posture of an individual, the direction of movement, will prove to be an alternative that can be interpreted by the car. So maybe you don't need complicated gestures at all. So much on the first learnings that we gained from our first experiments. What is really cool is that we can show you these examples, the spaxels and the space bots, the shared space bots, here at the festival, today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow at 2 p.m. You will find the areas right next to the FO15, which is one of the main attractions anyway. So you can't miss it. I'd be happy to see many of you there. Thank you very much.